Okay, now we will move on now to announce session 1, Transmitting Cultures for Tourism Enrichment and Mutual Understanding. As we prepare, we would like the panelists to get ready to walk up the stage. Now, this panel session will explore the relationship between tourism and the transmission of cultures. How can tourism be a force of good to help safeguard and promote cultural expressions, considering a series of contemporary challenges, such as the urbanization, migration, social and demographic changes, and the implementation of new technologies? Well, as we prepare for the stage, okay. As we prepare, we would like to watch a bit of a video here. And we will soon begin session 1, Transmitting Cultures for Tourism Enrichment and Mutual Understanding. Thank you, participants, for coming on stage. And moderating this session is Professor Robin Bushell. He's with the School of Social Science and Institute for Culture and Society, Western Sydney University of Australia. Professor Bushell, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure and honour to chair this session on transmitting culture and tourism enrichment and mutual understanding. On behalf of the panel, I would like to acknowledge the ancestors and the custodians of the land on which we are meeting. The panel, who I will introduce fully in a moment, is Dr. Mairi Mackay, Reverend Dako Matsuyama, Mr. Solomon Babaz Lapidos, Mr. Ben Sherman and Mr. George Stone. Thank you all for your time. The objectives of this conference are to foster dialogue between culture and tourism sectors, to ensure that cultural heritage, both tangible and intangible, and creativity are protected sensitively, ethically and responsibly. when utilised as a resource for tourism purposes. The conference, as we've heard earlier, is a continuation of the discussion on how tourism and the culture sectors can work collaboratively and productively, ensuring good outcomes through mutual understanding and the adherence to the principles of ethical and sustainable tourism. The World Tourism Organisation, through the World Committee on Tourism Ethics, an independent body of the UNWTO, oversees the Global Code of Ethics for Tourism and has worked with the World Indigenous Tourism Alliance to produce and adopt in August this year recommendations on sustainable development of Indigenous tourism, as was mentioned this morning in the opening address. We will hear from Mr. Ben Sherman, who is the current chair of the World Indigenous Tourism Alliance, during this session. The recommendations build on their Larrakia Declaration produced in Australia in 2012. First Nation people throughout the world look to a rights-based approach from tourism policymakers and industry leaders, as well as from the creative industries. The principles in the recommendations require that cultural tourism should be respectful. Tourism should respect local custodians. It should involve ongoing consultation in all phases of planning, design and management of tourism products and services that are built around Indigenous culture and lands. It should facilitate the empowerment of local Indigenous communities through appropriate governance structures. It should involve equitable partnerships to ensure that local Indigenous enterprises and outcomes. It should ensure protection of natural and cultural heritage by actively identifying and avoiding any adverse impacts. These principles are indeed the basis of responsible tourism, and local communities worldwide, not only First Nations people, might also expect a similar approach should or could become the norm. That the rights of the custodians of local heritage and culture be recognised and respected by tourism investors, developers, tourism officials and by the visitor. The residents of tourism hotspots like Venice, Paris, Siem Reap, Luang Prabang, Kyoto, no doubt would all hope for this. That what is culturally important, what is sacred, what is significant, is treated with dignity and with care. So how do we better transmit these cultural values? The situation in Uluru-Kata National Park in Central Australia, recent times, hundreds of visitors have asserted their rights, despite decades of traditional owners asking politely for people to respect their most sacred Uluru and not to climb. The case demonstrates just how selfish and ignorant some operators and some tourists can be. Sadly, it is not the only example. Climbing the pagoda of Borobudur, the temples of Angkor, taking photos of monks during almsgiving in Luang Prabang, taking selfies with the Geiko and Maiko here in Kyoto. The list, regrettably, is quite long. But it should not be reliant on the local people having to defend themselves and their everyday life. It's beholden on us, the policymakers, the industry leaders, the experienced, to establish, encourage and, as necessary, to enforce best practice, as was necessary in Uluru. Signs and brochures are simply not enough, although I'm very encouraged to hear from the Mayor of the many practices that they're introducing here in Kyoto. And of course it's not simple. Culture faces many challenges, especially in times of extensive and rapid urbanisation, migration, social, demographic change. Agreement on what is best practice is not a given. However, despite all the complexity, we have to ask ourselves, can tourism be a force for good? Can it help to safeguard and promote cultural expression? Today and tomorrow we will consider how to refine our thinking and change our practices. This session discusses the relationship between tourism and the transmission of culture for tourism enrichment. The keynote speech this morning by Princess Akiko of Makassar provided some wonderful insights, as did the ministerial panel. This panel will also share experiences from around the world representing diverse perspectives to discuss how tourism and the creative industry stakeholders are working with community groups, practitioners and other tradition bearers to strengthen systems for transmitting culture, supporting cultural diversity and enabling local stakeholders to have a voice in how tourism is managed both now and in the future, and in so doing, providing high-quality tourism experience. This is essential if we are going to protect both the heritage values and the value of tourism to local places. So it is my pleasure to now introduce our first panellist, Dr. Mari Mackay, the Director of Social and Creative Economies for the British Council. Dr. Mackay is an economist, a writer, and an ambassador for the emerging regenerative economy. She currently leads a portfolio of global programs for the British Council that demonstrate the contribution of culture and creativity in making and identifying sustainable and inclusive responses to global challenges. She was previously responsible for establishing global social enterprise programs across 30 countries, so she brings a wealth of experience. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Mackay.
Thank you very much, Robin, and it's a great pleasure and a huge honour to be here today. As Robin said, I work for the British Council. I have done for almost 10 years now, and have been for most of that time running programmes related to social enterprise, working with grassroots entrepreneurs and governments to look at how we can develop entrepreneurship that supports a social purpose. For the last few years, that has been very much led and focused around ideas of the SDGs, and it's been a really fascinating time to work right around the world and just to see the way that attitudes are changing to entrepreneurship and to values. What has been very evident and interesting in the last, I would say, 2 years in particular, and it's been interesting because of the speed at which this has become very prominent, is that, you know, for a long time, many of us who have worked in any kind of economic development sphere, whether that's tourism, culture, the social economy, or mainstream business, we have, of course, understood the challenges that the world is facing, but it has become increasingly clear that those challenges are crises, and they are very, very interconnected, and that the way that we are currently responding is not sufficient to address them. And so we're seeing, at the individual level, a crisis of citizenship and opportunity or agency and sense of identity. At the institutional level, a sense of crisis of purpose and the capability of either business or institutions to respond effectively to what we need. And at the systemic level, a crisis of innovation and leadership. We can talk about that in terms of our politics or in many other ways. But what we know is that the way that the world is right now, we need to behave differently. We need to understand things differently. And I think there's a really important narrative around values and capital that is beginning to take centre stage in a way that it has not before. We talk a lot about values, everybody in this room, and it's been mentioned very many times already this morning. It's crucial to the way that we understand the sacredness of tourism and of place and of people and of the planet, but we don't give it centre stage. And similarly, when we talk about capital, many of the ways that we have tried to think about solutions for the current world crises have immediately focused on financial capital. I've been very involved in the impact investment movement, which is powerful and important, but it's not the only answer. We have to start thinking about capital in terms of human capital, creative capital, cultural capital, and social capital. And we need to give those forms of capital a centre stage that they deserve, and that is important if we're going to progress. So the way the British Council has been responding to that, we have a number of programmes that have been new within the last 2 or 3 years. We have a large-scale programme in partnership with the government, which is a cultural protection fund. We have a programme called Cultural Heritage for Inclusive Growth, and one that I was very involved in designing and developing, called Developing Inclusive and Creative Economies. And essentially that took elements of the work the British Council had been doing, but had been doing not in such a connected way. So we brought together the work in social enterprise and creative economy, and have been working with grassroots entrepreneurs around the world in a number of emerging economies, with artists, with cultural agencies, with ecosystem players and with governments to really think about what the new conversation is around a different kind of way of thinking about inclusive and creative economies, and really putting arts, culture, humanity at centre stage. This is a slide I've borrowed from somebody else, one of a number of increasingly prominent economists who are talking about moving away from ideas of GDP and growth to ideas of thriving, and really redefining what we mean by economy. And what I like about this particular model is the idea that the SDGs really have provided this mobilizing framework in a way that we didn't have before. So what has become increasingly evident is that academics, business, across the entire spectrum, everybody understands the principles of the SDGs, and it's allowing us to mobilize different ways of thinking, different models of working together, different programs, different prospects. And the idea that, we've talked a lot for the past decade or two about sustainability, but essentially sustainability is doing no harm. It's a way of redressing balances, perhaps, or not making things worse. But what we're really seeing in some of the new programs that we are developing, and I think the conversation that we're having here this morning, is a different level of that. It's talking about how we become regenerative, how we really understand how the way that we work together and the way that we think about what we're doing is not only not going to make things worse, but it's going to create win-win solutions to make things better. I've spent a lot of my 20-year career thinking about economic development and collaboration, and the idea that competition and collaboration are fundamentally different ways of operating. And what I have found very interesting in the last 2 to 3 years is that there is now a recognition that the kind of inequalities that we're seeing in the world, the kind of unsustainability that we're seeing, the kind of crisis that we're all having to address, is not going to be resolved by understanding or by continuing to feed ideas of a competitive market view of the world. For me, and I'm not an expert in tourism, although I have worked on the margins of it for quite a long time, but the idea that we see tourism as a sector which is fundamentally successful if it generates economic growth, in and of itself might be problematic, and that may be part of what we need to rethink, in the same way as we have to rethink all of the way that we are thinking about economic development. We are beginning to understand that competitive markets don't solve problems, the kind of problems that we know we have, and that we need to move towards having co-creative systems that are sustainable, self-generating, supportive, and appreciate what is sacred in the world. So I think that we understand that, and I've certainly been around many people and around the world where there are increasing numbers of extraordinary, innovative entrepreneurs, system developments, policy developments. But in all of that, we need to begin to change the language and the framing within which we see that. So for me, a very simple model which I've started thinking about is that we need to look beyond, we need to remember and pay attention to what is sacred. We need to look around and pay attention to the wisdom of nature, which teaches us everything we need to know about complexity and systems and sustainability and regeneration. We need to look across and really consider the wisdom of our communities, and particularly our Indigenous communities, which is increasingly evident, hold most of the answers to making the planet safe and sustainable for going forward. And we need to look within and really value human creativity and human agency in a different kind of way. So that's what I would like to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think that sort of notion of reframing our thinking and self-generating systems are something that is seriously got to be our conversation immediately. The next panellist I would like to introduce is the Reverend Daiko Matsuyama. He is the Deputy Priest of the Taizan Zen Buddhist Temple here in Kyoto. Reverend Matsuyama organises intercultural activities such as Zen experience tours for foreign visitors and talks at embassies in Japan and at the Foreign Correspondents Club. In 2009, he was elected to be a Japan Tourism Agency Ambassador for its Visit Japan campaign. He's been a member of Kyoto's Ambassadors for Tourism since 2011, and he's very actively involved in US-Japan programs and a visiting lecturer in the United States. So he brings a lot of experience as well as a youthful perspective. I'd like to introduce Reverend Matsuyama.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I would like to welcome you to Kyoto as representatives of Kyoto citizens. So as I said, as I'm introduced, my name is Daiko Matsuyama, I'm Deputy Head Priest of Taizan Zen Buddhist Temple. So I would like to introduce myself using the video of 1 minute, and I would like to introduce the examples of our the monasteries. So please enjoy the video first. So I would like to introduce a little bit about myself and the complex. So I'm from the Myoshinji Zen Temple complex. So we are founded around 650 years ago and headquarters of Rinza Zen sectors in Japan. And we have around 3,400 branch temples all over Japan. And so Myoshinji is the headquarters. And we consist of 46 small temples. The size is almost 100 acres. So it's the biggest temple in Kyoto city areas. So I'd like to introduce you the examples of our monastery about the tradition and creation of the culture. So culture and tourism are like two axles of a car. So constant creation of value is essential. People don't want to just watch tradition decaying. On the other hand, they won't be interested for long in something that is newly made for only for the sake of novelty. So it won't pass the time of the time if it doesn't have value. The culture is a dynamic interaction of the inheritance of tradition and the addition of innovation. So tradition is not doing nothing, but rather nurturing that equilibrium. So I think the concept of moving equilibrium is very important. So, for example, you can find the place which is called in Arashiyama in Kyoto, so western part of Kyoto. And there you can find very beautiful river and bridge. And on the river, you can find some boats floating. And imagine you are on the boats, and I'm on the bridge. And I shout to you that, do not move. Okay? So there are two understandings. So first understanding is literally doing nothing, do not move. So this is the first understanding. The second understanding is that if you in the middle of the river, so do not move from that place. So this is the second understanding. So river is always flowing and running. So if you do not want to leave from that place, so you have to keep moving. So this is moving equilibrium. So this is the concept of the traditions. So tradition is not doing nothing, but we have to add the values to that tradition always. So I'd like to introduce you the examples of from Myoshinji. We have the history of more than 600 years. And so this is the Buddha hall of our monastery. So this Buddha hall was built in 1597, so 420 years ago. And in this, the Buddha hall, we have the paintings on the screens, originally painted around 400 years ago. So, of course, it's original painting, so it's all, if we do nothing, so it will be decaying, and we have to preserve it. But now, so many temples and shrines take means of digital printings, so digital archives. So of course I can understand the concept and their feelings, but if we take that means, so I think in 100 years or 200 years later, so they will write the history books that 21st century was the time of the canon and the absent, right? So I don't think it's good things. So the role of the temple is to grow people, So, so from that concept, we had the selections of the painters, young and no names, but had talent. And so we have 30 applicants, but we chose this lady. So she was 24 years old. She has, of course, she is talented, but has no name yet. And she was supposed not to touch the brush and the inks for first 6 months, but she had to complete the trainings of the monasteries. And then she is supposed to stay in the temple and live monastic life and complete more than 70 screens, 70 paintings on the screens. And so this is her first work in the temple. So as I said, the moving equilibrium is something like this. So if we preserve only old things and traditions, it is destined to decay. But we have to add new values and very important things in each area. And so that's why we have survived for more than 600 years. So in Japanese, so this is the Chinese characters, which means the tourism in Japan. So in Japanese, we call it the kanko. So the left character, so this is, it means to appreciate something or to show something. And the right character, so this is, the literary translation is to delight, but it means the treasures. So the true meanings of the tourism in Japan is to enjoy the treasures or to show our dearest guests our treasures of the countries. So that's why we should add the new values at any era. And so that's why we can create rich and everlasting cultures in Kyoto. So this is examples in our monastery. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think the Zen insights to the concepts of tradition are a very useful way of us considering, and discussions about authenticity earlier on. Our next speaker is Mr. Salomon Barbas Lapidus from Mexico. Mr. Lapidus is a cultural producer, a creator, and the founder of the Cumbre Tajin Festival and the Centre for Indigenous Arts, which is a formal public educational institution for the intergenerational transmission of Indigenous values through art and culture. In 2012, the centre was included in UNESCO's register of good safeguarding practices in intangible cultural heritage. Thank you, Mr. Lapidus.
Hello, I'm going to speak in Spanish, please. Buenas tardes. Es un honor compartir en este foro mi experiencia que da cuenta de la participación de los pueblos indígenas.
Good afternoon, everybody. Now, the indigenous experience can be shared with you, especially Totonac tribe culture and the Veracruz northern part of the tribe's culture is going to be introduced. Already 1100 or years of history is found, but one of the tools is the tourism so that we can make a succession of culture to the future generation. Through this culture activities, at the beginning, indigenous people who used to live try to make use of their tradition so that their villages can be sustainable. And fair development of a village development was the original goal. And Tashin sites is the sacred sites for the tribes. And that is respected by all the people. And that's the since 1999, Tahin Festival Summit has been conducted. Totonac tribes have their cultural tradition, and that should be regenerated. That's the theme for this festival. Fashion culture was born in the ancient Mexico. In this Tahin, various kinds of the socio-economic activities has been developed also. Already, towns where Totonacs live is the good examples of the villages for the indigenous people, widely appreciated in the world. And the model for these indigenous tribes is regarded as the important model for succession of culture, and their own cultural expression can be assessed by this tool. In this activity, elderly people had a succession of expression or languages and a worldview. All those are conveyed to the future generation. In this framework of the activity, for the purpose of succession of culture, we had a collaboration with the schools, local governments, and academia people. And because of that, in 2009, Graudores is the festival, and that's the Mexico's the cultural heritage of humanity that was inscribed by UNESCO. That is the ritual ceremony, Borador. This could be the important model for the world to safeguard these heritage. Mysterious activities are incorporated in this tradition, and in the Boradores there is a spirit of tradition, and ritual ceremony of Borador has been taught to the children. Through these activities, the bonds of the tribes should be succeeded into the future, and we think so. And our activities are centered in the establishment of a Center for Indigenous Arts. By having this, our intangible cultural assets should be succeeded, and that was inscribed by the Intangible Cultural Heritage of Humanity by UNESCO. In this slide, you can see a lot of activities and schools. For example, ritual teaching. And ritual is not just entertainment. In order to succeed their culture into the future, this is the tool. That's the positioning of the school. And many are cooperating, and with the Totonac Cultural Committee, we have been developing this curriculum in order to have the future development. We established the schools to teach these traditional things, and then how we can develop the human resources or talents. Those are the continuing theme for us. Having those talents in the future will lead into the succession of the culture. By having this type of structure, ritual ceremonies or the culture of the Totonac tribes have been educated. Music, dancing, pottery making, textile weaving, and cooking, and so on. Soccer, sporting activity, and other various handicrafts have been taught at this school. This Center for Indigenous Arts is presenting the educational model that is based on the model of the Tajiking. Various types of knowledge related to the daily lifestyle is the basis in traditional sense. Knowledge inherently should be succeeded to the identity succession for the future generation in the Totonac tribes. Preservation of the identity is quite important, and for that purpose, knowledge of traditions, skills should be handed over to the future generation. That's what we should do. And one of those in the Tahin Summit, Equinox Day, spring and autumn, there are ceremonies conducted. And here in tourism, that is the driving force for revitalizing the local community. For that purpose, in Takitsuku Park, various activities have been unfolded. For example, Papankura, in that site, the best vanilla can be harvested. In that area, most of the UNESCO's cultural heritage is accumulated. In Boradores, that is a ritual, and the Tahin sites, when we look at those, since 1992, that has been inscribed as the intangible cultural heritage by UNESCO. Through these activities in Tahin model, we should further pursue the model so that we can promote the indigenous people's lives. One of those tools is the Tahin Summit. Other than that, Center for Indigenous Arts is another important tool. This Center for Indigenous Arts and the Tahin Summit, from several thousand years ago, knowledge was there that has been conveyed to the generation of the future, and that will be conveyed to the further future. Knowledge of the indigenous people and a tradition should be preserved and conveyed to the future generation. This is the goal for the center and the summit. We should recover all the knowledge that has been conveyed through the ancient times, and presence should be revived with the indigenous people. Identity should be preserved, and their sacred spiritual aspects should be recovered. Totonacan is always proud of the origin of their tribes. Thanks to this Tahin project, indigenous people are open to the rest of the world, and their voice is getting stronger so that that can be communicated to the rest of the world. And in the region, Totonacapan is one of the most vital indigenous cultural regions in the world. Now I would like to show you the video.
Nuestros logros nos permitan caminar por otros sueños. Queremos dar forma física a un complejo cultural único en América.
Complex cultural facilities should be further developed to the future. That's our goal. Our voice, our message, our culture should be dispatched to the rest of the world. And the cultural development will be leading to the socio-economic development through the community people's voice. We would like to send that message. This Tahin model should be the good model to preserve other tribes' indigenous culture. That's our expectation. Citizens and governments and all operators are the partners so that we can continue to have our culture. Life with dignity, identity, harmonization, dialogue, all can be born through our activities. Let's have dream together. In Totonacapan, for the last 15 years, we have confirmed that that is possible. We invite you to dream of a new economic support. Please make a wish for that together with us. And more people will visit us throughout the year so that the value of our cultural heritage should be recognized more strongly. And Tahin model should be the achievements by Mexico. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And again, another wonderful example. And I think within the whole concept of cultural transmission, the importance of intergenerational knowledge is actually a very key component. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mr. Ben Sherman, who I've mentioned already. He is the chairperson of the World Indigenous Tourism Alliance. He's an Indigenous member of the Oglala Lakota tribal nation and was born and raised on Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota in the USA. As well as being the current chair of the World Indigenous Alliance, he was a founding board member and has been with this global movement through its full journey. He's spoken at numerous international venues on the subject of supporting Indigenous rights through tourism. He's worked to create and promote a set of standards for Indigenous tourism that includes advocacy for rights, cultural preservation, environmental stewardship and community development. Welcome, Ben.
Le ampetaki iushkia chante washtea nape chiuzapi. Today, I greet you with a good heart and a warm handshake. And I said that to confuse the translators. As a representative of the World Indigenous Tourism Alliance, I wish to acknowledge the original owners of these lands and waters, and to declare my respect and love for the indigenous Ainu people. My brothers and sisters, the Ainu. I'll tell you a short story to start. We arrived in Darwin, Australia, in a warm day a few years ago. There were several of us from different countries who had communicated and had agreed to come together at this Indigenous Peoples Tourism Conference. We had agreed beforehand that we would do something important at this gathering. We were greeted by a community leader from the Larrakia tribe of Aboriginal people named Robert Mills, seated in the center of this photograph. Robert is a large, very kind man. He is a leader in the community. He is also a tourism guide for his own small business. He first took us to the sea, where he washed each of us in seawater and said a prayer blessing for each one of us. Robert then took us to the Larrakia lands outside of Darwin, where we met a gathering of his people and quite a number of his relatives. They embraced us warmly and offered some songs for us. A Maori member of our group responded with a prayer and a song for the Larrakia people. Robert had prepared a meeting place for us with tables set up under large shade trees. Throughout the day, our group met and developed plans to create an international indigenous tourism organization. Robert and his Larrakia people fed us, tended to us throughout the day. I had been on a meatless diet for several years, but on that day, I consumed a meal that included delicious kangaroo meat. Our meeting and planning was conducted with the greatest goodwill and good spirit. At the end of the day, we had concluded the planning for the World Indigenous Tourism Alliance. We agreed that Johnny Edmonds, pictured on the far right of this photograph, would lead the organization from his home in New Zealand. We attended the Indigenous Tourism Conference over the next 2 days as representatives of our new organization. Johnny and I participated with the conference sponsors that were the Pacific Asia Travel Association and Australia's Northern Territory in the development of a declaration for that conference. Our draft declaration was presented to the conference, where we made a few changes until the document was accepted unanimously by the full conference. We asked for help in naming this declaration. Robert Mills was in the audience. He suggested naming it the Larrakia Declaration. The vote was unanimous. Johnny Edmonds subsequently announced the formation of the new organization to the media. UNWTO was born, and UNWTO would support the advancement of Indigenous community well-being through tourism, while supporting the principles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Our next effort was to submit the Larrakia Declaration along with other supporting information to UNWTO. That was important to us to advance our cause. We received a favorable response from UNWTO along with their subsequent approval and endorsement, which was a significant achievement. We then were told that the Larrakia Declaration was to be part of a foundation for a new set of principles being written by UNWTO that would guide world governments, and the tourism industry in their relationships with indigenous communities worldwide. UNWTO was invited by UNWTO to participate in the development of those recommendations. 4 of us from UNWTO made contributions to the review process and the recommendations. Chairman Pascal Lamy of the UNWTO World Ethics Committee thanked us for our contributions to what was soon a finished document. The support of UNWTO for the Larakia Declaration strengthened our international work, as through the recent years, the Larakia Declaration became a significant tool for the advancement of indigenous tourism through collaboration and relationships with government and industry. With the recommendations that you see on the slide here now being released, you can find it on the UNWTO website. We expect that our position will be further strengthened in our activities around the world. UNWTO has developed an international voice since that day when Robert Mills washed us in seawater and blessed us. As we worked around the world, we confirmed what we already knew, that indigenous people have an immense store of cultures, traditions, and earth wisdom to offer the world. Take the example that Solomon just presented to you that is occurring down in Veracruz, Mexico. He and his wife have made tremendous strides in highlighting the rich cultures of that land. Such rich cultures can be found throughout the indigenous world. However, in our work, we've also confirmed that the tourism industry has a long way to go yet to understand and embrace the value of contributions from indigenous people that could potentially contribute to the wealth and the health of the tourism industry. What we ask for in return is simple equity and justice for indigenous people. I won't take this time to tell you the story of indigenous people, colonization, and the damage that has been done all around the world. That's another story completely. But I will say that we wish to live on our traditional lands with free, prior, and informed consent of any government decisions that affect our people and our lands. We strive to practice our cultures free of unjust restraint. There are possibly 4 to 5% of the total world population are indigenous people in the world today. However, we occupy 20% of the world's land surface and are stewards for more than 80% of the planet's biodiversity. In other words, we know the earth well. We have, through the millennia, developed a great deal of earth wisdom that we have gained from living in all the climates of the world. Of course, with more than 5,000 different indigenous cultures and many languages, our indigenous people in the world account for most of the world's cultural diversity, as we show here. So, what are our values and aspirations? Well, our values and beliefs guide us in our aspirations. The values of generosity and sharing, humility, reciprocity, and love guide our tourism and hospitality programs. Our connection and care for Mother Earth is paramount. In the current condition of the world environment, those values and beliefs are becoming more important that we share widely with the population of the world. Cultural tourism is a great way to share that wisdom, and that is our pursuit. We believe in a creator that breathed life into all life on earth, including those with roots, those with wings, those with 4 legs, those that crawl on the ground, and those that swim in the waters, and those that burrow in the earth. And sharing the air and water and the soil of the earth, humans were created for the purpose of helping to sustain a healthy earth. And this is why at the end of every prayer and every ceremony, we say the words mitakoyasin, meaning we are all related. You are my brothers and sisters. From these values and beliefs comes the desire to build bridges of understanding, partnerships, and cooperation among all people of the world. And we believe that the UNWTO recommendations carry the potential for strengthening the case worldwide for Indigenous peoples' equitable inclusion in the tourism industry. Thank you for your very kind attention.
So thank you, Ben. Congratulations. Congratulations on the work of your organisation, on your collaboration and your individual very significant contributions to the work with the UNWTO, which I think will prove to be increasingly very, very important work. And I thank you also for your wisdom, and I agree we're at a time in which that sort of wisdom is greatly needed. So our next speaker is our final panel member, is Mr. George Stone. George is the Editor-in-Chief of National Geographic Travel. He's been a National Geographic writer and editor for 21 years, and he sees travel storytelling as a way to inspire people to explore the world, to develop meaningful cultural connections, and embrace an ethic of sustainability. George is the author of 2 books for National Geographic, and he directs the development of award-winning travel content that has extended the travel brand to new audiences, which includes more than 55 million followers on social media. Strengthened relationships with travel and tourism industry and organisational partners, and advanced the National Geographic mission to explore, but importantly to also protect our planet. Thank you, George.
Arigatou gozaimasu.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kyoto. Thank you, Japan. Thank you, UNWTO and UNESCO for hosting us. So this is a great honor to speak to you on behalf of National Geographic and to share a little bit, I hope, about our storytelling. Our storytelling is our tool. It's how we transmit ideas, and it's how we share what is sacred, as Mary has said, and what is unique and special about the world. So National Geographic was founded in 1888 with a mission of conservation and exploration, but above all, storytelling. And it was through National Geographic photographs and stories that people around the world sometimes got their very first glimpse of faraway places, of cultures they didn't know anything at all about. Balinese dancing from ages ago. Eliza Sidmore, who's a pioneering female photographer of National Geographic, more than 100 years ago traveled here to Japan and offered some of the very few first glimpses that Western readers have seen. And this was in the pages of National Geographic magazine. So along the way, we have helped share some of the places in the world that have since become World Heritage Sites. And since then, they've become tourist destinations. And then since then, they, at least some of them, have become overrun with tourists. And in some cases, emblems of an underperforming ethic of conservation, and certainly underperforming as centers of sustainable community development. So this is one of the issues that we are contending with and that we're grappling with in our travel content, and in fact, all of our content at National Geographic. But 131 years ago, we didn't know this would happen. In 1913, we published images from Hiram Bingham of his expedition in Peru to Machu Picchu. He was guided there, incidentally, by a young boy, a Quechua boy, who knew already very well where this citadel in the mountains existed. But he came back with some of the very first images that people had seen of this mystical world far beyond. When Jacques Cousteau was researching and studying reefs around the world for National Geographic, he didn't have a sense then of what climate change would do to those very reefs, what microplastics would do, and we have pursued these stories. And in villages in Zambia, in safari lands, which National Geographic has been covering extensively, we didn't know when we first started reporting how habitat encroachment and economic disparity would come to jeopardize rhinos and elephants and the very sources of curiosity that draw a lot of tourists and, in fact, revenue into those areas. But we know these things now, and we're working to do a lot about it. So with National Geographic's media platforms, and as Robin has mentioned, we have 55 million followers on our social media, but National Geographic overall has some 300 million followers. We have quite an opportunity, and in fact a responsibility, to share stories about what is going well in the world or what needs to be done better. We're very proud of a lot of our partnerships. One in particular that was mentioned by UNESCO's Deputy Director General this morning, as well as the Ministers of Tourism from Greece and the Czech Republic, is our World Heritage Journeys program, which is the European portion. A second portion is on Asia. And this is a terrific platform for sharing assets and intangibles that are central to the identity and cultural vitality of destinations around the world. We also have, of course, our publications. We have 17 international language editions of National Geographic Traveler magazine, my group, 35 editions of National Geographic magazine, and a massive global footprint also through Channel, National Geographic Channel. So the question is, how can we use this phenomenal platform to help change the world? What can we do? Especially in sustainable tourism, we needed to create a baseline. Following this year's WTTC in Spain, our chairman, Gary Nell, initiated a sustainable tourism survey of US travelers and the general population of the US. And what we discovered actually is somewhat sobering at the top to know that only 15% of Americans are familiar with what sustainable travel is. And yet, it's that problem that creates the huge opportunity for us in media to create stories, to travel the world, to connect with communities, to connect with individualities, to connect with destination stakeholders, and work with them, ideally so that they can share their story with us. So these other statistics are more promising to know that, that from the US general population, people, once they do understand some of the values of sustainable tourism, are willing to spend more, to prioritize it, to stay longer, to seek out sustainable travel options. And so it's that opportunity that we seek to embrace and embody in our storytelling. So then you might say, well, you know, National Geographic storytelling has to be different from a storytelling of other outlets. It has to support and carry our own mission. What does that mean? starting from the point of our goal to create a planet in balance or to support a planet in balance. Our content focuses on environmentally friendly practices, protecting cultural and natural heritage, providing social and economic benefit for local communities, respecting indigenous communities, and inspiring travelers themselves to become conservation ambassadors. So hearing that is one thing, but seeing it in action is different. And the next little segment is a short video of this wonderful person I have the honor to work with. His name is Fernando Baptista. He's Basque, and he's the chief illustrator of National Geographic. So he creates these amazing illustrations of extinct animals or of cities of the past. And he's a terrific and warm and ingenious person. And so I went up to him and I said, hey, Fernando, would you consider writing about Bilbao, where he's from, for us? And he said, didn't say much. And I caught up with him a few weeks later, and he said, well, I'm an artist. And I said, oh. I said, well, then maybe will you paint a picture? And he said, And I said, well, try. And so sure enough, he was headed off to Bilbao, and he decided he would paint a picture along the river, the city. And I said, maybe someone could take a picture of you painting the picture, and that would be cool. And this is what happens when someone who knows and loves a place and has their own idea of how a story should be told and wants to share that passion for place with others. This is what happens. Sorry. It happens when I press go.
Yo nací en el centro de Bilbao, en UNWTO, que es como corazón de la ciudad. Y bueno, para los bilbaínos yo creo que es la mejor ciudad del mundo. National Geographic para mí es como un sueño, ¿no? el estar trabajando aquí. La escultura yo creo que es la marca de mi trabajo. La gente no sabe que muchas veces hay una escultura detrás de mis gráficos, que uso esas esculturas para coger información, para hacer las ilustraciones. Entonces se me ocurrió la idea de hacer una ilustración sobre Bilbao. Pero, ¿qué pasaría si esa ilustración sería, pues, como un modelo de mí haciendo esa ilustración, ¿no? Me pareció que era interesante, era como colocarte enfrente del ilustrador cuando está haciendo la obra, ¿no? Y eso sería bonito, ¿no? Lo han hecho muchos pintores. Y bueno, pues cuando ya haces los bocetos con lápiz y papel y bueno, trabajando para la puesta en página, pues ya lo siguiente es construirlo. Eso a veces es complicado, ¿no? Primero tienes que diseñar los personajes, en este caso diseñarme a mí mismo, que bueno, eso no creo que fue muy complicado. Y luego tienes que construir todo. Y para construir todo tienes que experimentar. Yo nunca había construido, no sé, una caja de...
Doll is created here, and then I also made this kind of the paint. And in the past, I have never used the woods, but it was very enjoyable work I did. And of course, after that, I wanted to introduce Bilbao with illustration. Emblematic, the construction is here on the one single picture. And this is indeed the important thing for the readers.
Creativity, because creativity is a gift. And when that gift is shared, when it's transmitted, and when you have the opportunity to share it as a media platform, I think you're really doing something special. Just a concluding thought, and this is with gratitude to Princess Akiko. I'd like to offer a poem back to Japan by Matsuo Basho, who was born here, not so far away from here, really, in 1644. And so this is a haiku, and it's from his book, The Narrow Road to the Deep North and Other Travel Sketches. And I was drawn to it, of course. I'm a travel writer and a travel editor, and this is a travel book. The chestnut by the eaves is magnificent I'm sorry. The chestnut by the eaves in magnificent bloom passes unnoticed by men of this world. The chestnut by the eaves in magnificent bloom passes unnoticed by men of this world. So my question is, why would men pass a beautiful tree in bloom? Maybe they're travelers, or sorry, maybe they're headed off to work. I was going to say, if they were tourists, they would take a picture of it. But when people are very busy, they're not paying attention necessarily. It doesn't seem the most pressing thing. But maybe a chestnut tree in bloom before it's offered up its chestnuts isn't as valuable. And maybe that's one part of it. But I think the challenge is to see assets in their value throughout the span of their year, throughout the span of their life. The chestnut tree in the summer that offers shade, the chestnut tree in the spring that offers beautiful blooms that are ephemeral, and then the chestnut tree in winter when it's secluded away and it's taking care of itself. I equate this to some degree to the cultural assets of communities. They are valuable always. They are visible some of the time, but they're always to be cherished and always to be appreciated throughout the year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George, and thank you for your gift of creativity and sharing your storytelling with us today. So this last section of our panel, we're going to have some questions answered by the panel members and, time permitting, some questions from the floor. So I'm going to start by asking Dr. Mackay if she might comment on how creatives and tourism stakeholders meet each other's needs and might reach mutual commitment.
Thank you. I just want to start by saying I'm very humbled to be on this panel. It's been extraordinary just listening to everybody, so thank you. One of the programme that I mentioned, the Developing Inclusive and Creative Economies programme, at the moment we run that in 5 emerging economies: Brazil, Indonesia, Pakistan, South Africa and Egypt. And there's many things about that particular programme that have been very inspiring, but one of them has been just witnessing the number of organisations and individuals and artists that we are working with who, by being part of something that they feel is slightly bigger, have really taken a level of ownership and built community in terms of thinking about how they can take their own ideas, their own organisations, their own initiatives to a different kind of level. Many of the examples are where you see organisations who are deeply embedded in their own cultures and communities that are developing business ideas or regenerating communities or supporting local people through their initiatives. And we, as part of that programme, we partnered organisations in each of these 5 emerging economies with organisations in the UK's creative economy sector. And we awarded grants to partnerships between the various different groups. And we interviewed for those who, to identify who was going to be successful. And the number of times we had people crying in those interviews was really extraordinary. And the reason that there was so much emotion attached to it, I think, is because there are so many people around the world who are deeply, deeply invested in finding a new way of thinking about how we care for one another and the planet. And when they are given opportunities to feel like they're part of something larger to do that, it's very overwhelming. So it was nothing to do with the small amounts of money that were being awarded to develop those programs. It was very much about being part of something. And that's what we've seen, this complete movement of individuals who are self-organising and creating new initiatives, and young storytellers and all sorts of things that are coming from that programme that are not at all designed or were never designed from the beginning, and it's incredibly humbling to watch. So for me, just to close the question, I think that one of the most significant things is to really hold on to that level of agency and the power of storytelling, and to really believe in it, and to own and champion the idea that we need to move from a society that's completely obsessed with a consumer model of economy to a model of economy that is based around creativity and compassion. And my favourite quote to think about compassion is from Andrew Merton, which is that it's a keen awareness of the interconnectedness of all things. And I think that that's something that we can all give one another.
Thank you very much. I think it's possibly a question that a few of you may like to contribute to as well, given the nature of the work that you're all doing. So if any of the other panel members would like to talk about how mutual commitment has been reached in your work, if you'd like to also contribute. Polite. You don't have to be polite. You can we'll start with you then, George, and you can move on.
One trend that I've seen is an evolution of DMOs, destination management organizations, toward destination stakeholder organizations, increasing the recognition and the representation of the members of the communities within this destination, and actually sort of depositioning tourism as measured economically as the primary metric. And so this is a sort of obtuse. It's not as personal, but this is a trend I like, because any trend that is more inclusive, that is recognizing local stakeholders, recognizing voices and empowering of communities is something I think that is very good, very promising for travel and tourism, for destinations, and then above all for individuals who seek to experience something new and want to do that authentically, want to have authentic, meaningful experiences where they go. So this is a trend I'm very happy with.
Okay, would anyone else like to make any further comment on that point? If not, then I'll ask Reverend Matsuyama how, in his experience, tourism has been able to promote genuine respect for diversity of spiritual practices, given his experience here in Kyoto.
I think it's very difficult, the questions, and basically, so we highly cherish of course, the tourists, but local people. So our monastery is open to the public all around the year and 24 hours a day. So anyone can come and, for example, walking with dogs and kids playing, and we open to the public fully. But for the most important, for example, today, this is the most important and sacred day of the year, because this is anniversary day of the founder of our monasteries. So we have very, formal and spiritual ceremonies in this morning. And in that occasions, so of course we limit the participants. And normally this kind of ceremony will be held early in the morning. So for example, this morning we had the ceremony from 6 a.m. So it's because we need silence. So very quiet and dark, and it's very, very spiritual, the ceremonies. So I think it's very hard to shut down the access for the people to the temple. So in our monasteries, we're doing a kind of zoning of time, place, and opportunities. So this is the first step to preserve the spirituality. And the second point is that we do not change the programs. So for example, we are offering the overnight, the trainings for the lay people in our monasteries. So just experience our monastic life. But we will not change the program. And we have no compassions, no considerations. So for example, we are practicing meditation, very cold place, open all windows. So it's very cold, very hot, and very hungry. Okay? So if we keep these circumstances, for example, somebody comes to a temple to just take pictures and Instagrams or something like that. But these kind of people will give up in 30 minutes or 1 hour, right? And the people who are very enthusiastic and serious people can survive the program. And only these people can enjoy the beautiful scenery and the spirituality and the very tasty rice soup. So I think this is very important not to change the program for the peoples. So
I think many places, people in the room will agree that is the need to be true to your culture and not to turn it into performance or to simply accommodate tourism is an important principle and component. Thank you. Mr. Lapidus, you talked about the work that you're doing with intergenerational transmission, and would like to ask you what you think are some of the key factors in constructing a dialogue between the various stakeholders to create a successful program.
I'm going to answer in Spanish as well, please. Bueno, el camino no ha sido fácil.
Of course, the important things, there are many, and the dialogue is most important. The community, what they want to share, what they don't want to share, we have to know this. That is most important. For example, for the ritual, or the ritual of the indigenous people are mostly a religious one. It is not a performance. It is to pray for the God. So in that sense, in the indigenous people's culture, what is to be shared, what is not to be shared, that should be clarified first. So the visitors has to know their sacred time, their sacred spirit. That should be respected. In Totonaca tribe, they have their own time, and also there are political will that is important. The civic group, artists, and also the social group, and those group has to try to unify their will to materialize the wishes of a Totonaca tribe. And there is a school to transmit the spirit of Totonaca tribe. That is a place of learning and a place of sharing. And the important element and factors are now shared and transmitted by school. For example, when we visit there, first we will notice a very superficial objects, but the process to create those projects are on the background. So what is born out of that is, of course, the economic benefit, but more than that, a cultural benefit. For example, you take a photograph of a certain place, then you need to hand that picture to a person who are in the picture. You can video records, not just watching the video outside, but in the process of creating one video production, the communal people has to be involved. You have to pay attention to that. the very strong will to safeguard the culture is now being formed. The new generation is formed nowadays. And the message from us to them is as follows. The indigenous people is on Earth, and they are the kind of guardians of the Mother Earth. So we have to invest them so that they can transmit their tradition to the next generation. And to invest for the transmission means that we have to focus the knowledge of senior people, the older folks, and we are able to construct a bridge to the next generation by knowing the old knowledge through SNS or through videos, through many tools. The tribe of Maya or Totonaca, the language and the culture must be transmitted to the outside world. And the outside world, people can take in their wisdom. And in order to transmit the traditional wisdom, sometimes the education is compulsorily given, but more than that, there should be a kind of a voluntary will on the part of a communal people to know those traditional knowledge and the indigenous people's knowledge, as the assistant priest mentioned, that the vice priest mentioned that by showing the practice like that, the visitor's mind will be opened towards a new stage, and a new spirituality will be available to the visitors. So in the area the indigenous people are living, tourism is very important. But at the same time, the environmental protection must be promoted. So finally, the Totonaca tribe thinks that everybody, every human being born on Earth has its own ability and capacity, but the ability must be developed, identified, found, and refined. And that ability must be shared with the world. If not sharing with the world, that ability will be lost or decayed. That has been said from the ancestor. So each one of us has its own talent, skills, and we want to share them with the world.
The points about transmitting respect for elders and for elder knowledge and for the environment, I think are key messages that I think everyone has mentioned. So now to Ben, perhaps you could share with us some of your thoughts about how international initiatives like the recommendations on sustainable development for international tourism, is that making a difference? Is this helping tourism enterprises, and how are Indigenous communities responding to the work that's being done?
Thank you. I have a slightly different view of the word sustainable, and sometimes I have trouble with the word because the question arises, are we trying to sustain the existing condition? And if so, is that right? And my answer is obviously no. We have done so much damage and destruction in the name of not only tourism but other industries that we cannot accept the status quo. We cannot talk about mitigation for every damage that is done. Mitigation here, mitigation there. You know, that adds up to a lot of mitigation or a lot of destruction. So let's eliminate the word mitigation for one thing, and let's start using the word repairing. Let's repair Mother Earth and make every enterprise contribute to the improvement of the environment rather than having to mitigate again and again and again. So let's be very careful with the word sustainability. I believe that a tourism destination cannot claim sustainability until they have fully engaged the indigenous and the rural people and the poor people somehow in the overall enterprise of tourism, and that includes the participants in the industry, in the destination. Everyone must look at how they can embrace not only the people who are in the margins of our societies, but also the environment, which does not have a voice, but needs to have a voice in all of these decisions about sustainability. So that's my take on sustainability, Robin. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that obviously, I think the sustainability as a word is obviously problematic to lots of people, and I think the more we have conversations around what we really mean and what our goals are, that's an important aspect. And then finally for George, you might just comment for us a little bit about what National Geographic is doing to communicate the need for cultural values for future generations.
Sure. One thing that I've been working on is what I'm calling simply a travel compact, which is a starting point to define how we relate to our global audience and to help support our content. So what I have so far, this is a draft, is that each traveler is a curious explorer who seeks to connect with the world and build an ethic of conserving what is special about places. And then each destination steward is a community member who values and seeks to protect the area's resources for future generations to enjoy. So this is just a work in progress kind of idea where we assume the best of our audience and we expect the best of destinations as far as how they're representing themselves, as far as how they're supporting their own communities. Very idealistic. But I don't mind starting there and then using that as a guide for how we then construct our travel stories and our travel media. We publish about 30 stories digitally a month and in print, and that's really not too many. So we need to be selective about the places we cover, and we really need to lean into our reporting on those as well. One thing that my boss, the editor-in-chief of National Geographic magazine, Susan Goldberg, has done, she's undertaken a study of the diversity of the contributors, photographers, writers, scientists, and including people who are quoted on the ground in all the articles that we're doing. And of course, well, not of course, but unfortunately, the results aren't very good right now. You know, it's a lot of the same contributors, people who are known. It's often stories that aren't being told by people with a local stake in the story. It takes more work to do that, but we are committed to doing that. So I think that's important as far as where travel storytelling is going. Is looking for ways to work so that communities are telling their stories, that we in the media, in the travel media at least, are actually functioning again as we should, as mediators. So we are connective and we're a platform and we are supporting stories, but we are not making up stories. We are trying to hear the stories and to share them with our audience, and that in turn creates a travel audience that's better prepared to be more curious on the ground and to embrace what is there. And also, I think, as a travel practice, to be more sensitive and responsible and a bit less ego-driven when they visit places and say, it's okay to pay attention, it's okay to slow down and to follow along. This has visible implications when you see people snapping pictures, as you noted earlier, and everywhere you look. But I think good behavior does beget good behavior, and for us, our best editorial intentions, I think slowly will produce stories that have better diversity of contributors, better diversity of the people who are represented in the story, stakeholders of communities, and are better for travelers as well to plan trips to the most interesting places for the most worthwhile experiences.
Well, thank you very much, and I think a nice place to finish, and unfortunately we're out of time, so we won't have questions for the floor, but we'll all be around later this afternoon, so that if people have got comments or questions, you can speak to the panel members individually. To just sum up, I think some points that were made was the idea of moving to creativity and compassion, to inclusion and empowering communities seem to be important ideas that everybody has expressed. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the panel and ask you all to join me in thanking them very much for their presence today.
I'd like to thank once again the panelists for their participation of Transmitting Cultures for Tourism Enrichment and Mutual Understanding. And thank you very much, Professor Robin Bushell, for moderating this session. Thank you. You may step down, leave the stage. And if everybody can give the panelists a big hand once again. Thank you. It was a lovely presentation by everybody from their different perspectives and the different roles they play representing different organizations.